La da 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 dee, la da da. La da da dee, la da 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 da, la da da da. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is a privilege, once again, to be here. Thank you. I'm Victoria Mature, daughter of Victor Mature, the star of our next film, I Wake Up Screaming. And that music I was singing is by Alfred Newman. It's called Street Scene, and it was featured over and over again in the 20th Century Fox noir films of the 1940s. It was featured in 3 of my dad's noir films of that same era: I Wake Up Screaming, Kiss of Death, and Cry of the City. And in 1947, as part of the publicity campaign for Kiss of Death, lyrics by Harold Adamson were added to the melody by Alfred Newman. Sheet music was printed and distributed, and Sentimental Rhapsody was born. So when filming started for I Wake Up Screaming in 1941, the film had a completely different title. It was called Hotspot, which seems like a particularly appropriate title for today's 107-degree weather. But the title wasn't the only alteration. Betty Grable's character in this iteration of the storyline was an aspiring singer who worked in a music shop during the day, and at one point she even demonstrates a song called Daddy for an eager 70-something woman looking for something sexy and sassy to sing to her husband at his 80th birthday party. When this version of the film went in front of preview audiences, it totally bombed. With a title like Hotspot and a musical comedy star like Betty Grable, the audiences had expected a musical about a nightclub singer, and instead, they got a shadowy crime drama with a random musical comedy number. Ironically, these alterations to character and story had been made specially for these same audiences in an attempt to soften and sell what was to be Grable's very first dramatic leading role on the big screen. After the previews, 20th Century Fox studio head Darryl Zanuck returned to the original title from the novel by Steve Fisher that the film is based on, I Wake Up Screaming. I mean, how can you find a better title than that? So I Wake Up Screaming. Now, that title was clear. No musical numbers to see here. Well, almost. And there's also a scene added by Zanuck. It takes place at a public pool where Betty and Victor are laughing and swimming together in their bathing suits. But for some reason, those same audiences, the ones who didn't like Hotspot, those same audiences didn't seem to mind the bathing suit scene. I can tell you that my dad and Betty Grable hated it. But say what you will about Darryl Zanuck, he was no dummy. He knew what would sell. When filming started on I Wake Up Screaming in 1941, no one knew or even thought they were making a film noir. That term didn't even exist until it was coined years later by French critics. And you can't really mention that I Wake Up Screaming is arguably the first film noir without also discussing The Maltese Falcon. Both were filmed at the same time, both have Elisha Cook Jr., and both were released within months of each other. The beginning of the 40s, it might be called the dawn of film noir, but with any dawning or transition period in film, art, music, no one example, in this case film, had every aspect of what we now in hindsight call, in this case, noir. The Maltese Falcon, of course, had the doomed storyline and the clipped, somewhat emotionless Hammett dialogue that most aficionados associate with noir. But the Maltese Falcon's visual style, apart from a few key scenes, is very much of the 1930s. And though, of course, well-directed and shot and acted, visually, it doesn't offer much that audiences haven't already experienced. I Wake Up Screaming comes from the somewhat more emotionally charged storyline and writing style of Steve Fisher. But also, it stars Betty Grable and Victor Mature, as opposed to Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor. Victor and Betty are younger, a more traditionally glamorous Hollywood leading couple. In 1941, Betty Grable is a popular musical comedy actress and a talented entertainer whose star is very much on the rise. Victor Mature has proved himself popular with audiences, but nobody seems to know what to do with him yet. So he's played everything from a gangster to a caveman to a swashbuckler to a Broadway producer to a corrupter of young women in an opium den in von Sternberg's The Shanghai Jester. I Wake Up Screaming is Victor's 5th film, his 4th leading role, and his first movie at a major studio, 20th Century Fox. At this point in his career, he is synonymous with light popular fare, including a successful leading role on Broadway in 1941 in Lady in the Dark, a musical play written by Kurt Weill, Ira Gershwin, and Moss Hart. So the powers that be at 20th Century Fox, mainly Daryl Zanuck, capitalize on what they've got. They purposely lighten up the I Wake Up Screaming story a bit to suit the actors' brands, and more importantly, to suit the intended audience and the hoped-for profit margin. We don't get as much of the hard-boiled dialogue and the doomed relationships that we all now might expect in a noir film, but what we do get in I Wake Up Screaming, that is both novel and exciting, is a new visual palette. Nodding to German expressionism, the cinematographer Edward Kronjäger gives us beautiful and arresting chiaroscuro images. And not just the images, because what is notable is that these visual moments of dark and light and angles are crafted purposefully, and time is taken both to craft them and to let the audience take them in. Director Bruce Humberstone and screenwriter Dwight Taylor and novelist Steve Fisher give us fascinating contrasts. Drama is balanced by humor. And when I had the privilege of introducing this film with Eddie Muller at the Noir City Festival in San Francisco, that was the first time I saw it on the big screen. And it was the first time I realized, by the audience's enthusiastic reaction, that there are some really funny one-liners in this movie, and we're all supposed to be laughing at them. And some of the most beautiful visual moments in the movie, well, they happen in the most unexpected and ugly times and places. In fact, one of the most gorgeous images ever taken of my dad is in the scene where he's being interrogated at the police station in I Wake Up Screaming. And you'll know it when you see it. He's in the hot spot. The Maltese Falcon is revered for its definitive noir storyline and dialogue, but it's those beautifully crafted images from I Wake Up Screaming that are regularly used to this day to illustrate that quintessential visual aesthetic that defines classic film noir. And that concludes the lecture portion of this. There's another song featured in I Wake Up Screaming, and it's called These Are the Things I Love. It's sung by Carol Landis. It's originally a Tchaikovsky melody that was put together and written by Harold Barlow and Lewis Harris. And this was a popular tune in 1941, covered by all the major swing bands. I bought some vintage sheet music of this song, and it features Tommy's brother Jimmy Dorsey on the cover page. It also advertises another cover of the song performed by Gene Krupa and his orchestra. While filming I Wake Up Screaming in 1941, Victor Mature signed his first contract with 20th Century Fox. And he and Betty Grable went on to star in 3 more movies together, all musicals. Starting in 1942, Betty's career ascended into the stratosphere. Betty Grable would be one of the top 10 box office stars for 10 consecutive years. During World War II, she was, of course, the most popular pinup girl among American soldiers. And in 1946, she would be making a higher salary than 20th Century Fox studio head Daryl Zanuck. Betty Grable was also an inspiration to the young Marilyn Monroe, who starred with Grable in the other first CinemaScope picture, not The Robe from 1953, starring Victor Mature, but How to Marry a Millionaire, which also randomly featured an orchestral version of Alfred Newman's Street Scene. My dad and Betty Grable made 2 of those 3 musicals together in 1942. They're called Song of the Islands and Footlight Serenade. They're light, very lucrative, and escapist fare. There were many vacations for people from the inescapable and frightening news of World War II. I Wake Up Screaming was released in December of 1941, and December of 1941 is also when the United States entered World War II. In November of 1942, Victor Mature officially entered World War II. My dad served 3 years in the United States Coast Guard, and when World War II finally ended, that's when Victor Mature finally got his opportunity to shine as an actor. And nowhere had he shone brighter than in the shadowy world of noir. Ironically, it was Victor Mature's great success in post-World War II noir films that made him the star of the blockbuster sword and sandal genre. His box office and critical success in My Darling Clementine, Kiss of Death, Cry of the City landed him the role of Samson in Cecil B. DeMille's comeback epic, Samson and Delilah, in 1949. And this was the film that catapulted Victor Mature into full-fledged international stardom. But back to I Wake Up Screaming. Victor Mature and Betty Grable would remain lifelong friends. My dad would introduce Betty to her second husband, the famed trumpeter and band leader, Harry James. And in 1944, Betty and Harry would welcome their first child into the world and name her Victoria. Grable was also the recipient of one of my dad's many rescue dogs. Hers would be a sweet little white terrier that would ultimately travel the world with Betty and her mother. And nothing says film noir more than the iconic popular song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, which is featured almost as much as Alfred Newman's street scene in the score of I Wake Up Screaming. Why? Why, you might ask. Perhaps, I don't know. My take on it is that at this time, Somewhere Over the Rainbow and The Wizard of Oz, they weren't the giant icons of pop culture they've been made into today. Much like the song These Are the Things I Love, Somewhere Over the Rainbow was just a popular tune, covered by the bands and vocalists of the era. But these musical moments of levity in I Wake Up Screaming, they were used to help sell the idea of Betty Grable in her first dramatic role. Somewhere Over the Rainbow was used to convey whimsy and romance in I Wake Up Screaming, and served as yet another interesting contrast, white and black, light and shadow, humor and drama, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and Laird Krieger. Though Victor Mature's career spanned 45 years, and though he starred in films directed by the likes of John Ford, Robert Siodmak, Robert Wise, Cecil B. DeMille, Henry Koster, Richard Fleischer, Jacques Tourneur, and Vittorio De Sica, to name a few, my dad never took his fame or himself too seriously. He thought of his work as something ephemeral. He would be very surprised by the growing worldwide interest in his filmography, particularly in his noir films. But he would be amazed at the idea of all of us sitting here together in the theater, about to watch I Wake Up Screaming on the big screen the way it was meant to be seen, 80 years after its original release. You might remember my dad's famous self-deprecating line, "I'm no actor, and I've got 64 pictures to prove it." Well, he might have thought his films were frivolous, but the fact that we're all gathered here now is a testament to the enduring legacy of his work and to the enduring legacy of noir. Enjoy I Wake Up Screaming. Da 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 dee. Da 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 la da da dee da la da da dee.